At first, I would like to introduce Frank Hogan. And as I said, it is because of the Trainor Foundation that we are able to have this award presented each year. Frank once chided me that it is a sad dog that won't wag its own tail. And so I am going to explain to you why Frank is one of the most valued members of our board and what kind of sense of service to others, as is the ethos of this university, he has lived. Frank is the chairman of the Overseas Service Corporation, which helps provide familiar brand products, a touch of home as they call it, to U.S. service members and their families throughout the U.S. military commissaries and exchange system. OSC is especially proud of the fact that 55% of its workforce is composed of military veterans or family members. And among the touches of home that it brings to our service people around the world is Procter & Gamble. Can we hear it for Procter & Gamble? Yay, Procter & Gamble. Also on our board. It's a very close board. The Hershey Corporation, Tyson's Food, and Smuckers, including, for those of you who live as I do on Snapple. I'm sorry. Frank has served his country as a member of the U.S. Marine Corps and attended college on the GI Bill at both Brown University, and he is an alum of Georgetown's University's School of Foreign Service, BSFS. He began his career at OSC in the mailroom. So for all of our students here, yes, go and take that entry-level job, do well, and you too can climb up the ladder and become the president and CEO of a major corporation. That's not a promise, it's just something to aspire to. It is possible. Frank has long been a vigorous advocate for the military, for military resale benefits through his leadership positions in the Armed Forces Marketing Council, the Coalition to Save Our Military Shopping Benefits, and American Logistics Association. And the latter bestowed upon him a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work. He is also a faithful supporter of military charitable causes, including Fisher House Foundation, the Semper Fi Fund, and the National Military Family Association. He is the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Trainor Endowment, as well as a member of our Board of Advisors. He resides in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. And as I mentioned, Frank was a Marine. His son serves in the Marine Corps, and his grandson is a Marine. And so if you want to see a living embodiment of someone who in himself embodies service to others and exemplifies this throughout his family and his service, Frank Hogan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara, for that over-the-top introduction. I'm very flattered indeed. Ambassador Shannon, Dean Hellman, Ambassador Gutierrez, Ambassador Bowden, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and warm greetings to all. It is a great pleasure to speak with you tonight with regard to the endowment that makes the Trainor Award possible. The Trainor Award and Lecture Series was established in 1976. It is celebrating excellence in the conduct of diplomacy. It was established by the alumni of the School of Foreign Service as a living memorial to J. Raymond JIT Trainor. Tonight's honoree appropriately joins the list of the distinguished Trainor recipients who have been so recognized since the inception of the award. Luminaries all who have served with great distinction and honor in the pursuit of peace and understanding among nations. It is also a particular pleasure and honor to recognize you, Ambassador Shannon, as an outstanding career diplomat who was and is a notably and noble, committed person to this profession, institution, and people of the Foreign Service and State Department. When J. Raymond Trainor entered Georgetown as an eager young freshman in 1923, you can be sure that he found that he was in a strange environment and had no inkling he would remain with this great institution for the next 33 years, let alone leave such an important legacy. Doubtless, he also did not realize that he would pick up a nickname that would stay with him for the rest of his life. From the jitney he drove to help finance his education, probably the Uber of its day. JIT made his mark at the School of Foreign Service as secretary and registrar, and in those capacities, he guided it with a firm hand and enjoyed the complete confidence of the school's founder, the eminent Father Edmund A. Walsh. However, what made JIT the special person that he was his overpowering focus on his students. They were the family that he and his wife never had. Though he had opportunities to be dean, and in fact he served as acting dean for a while, JIT decided to eschew the position of dean because of fear that it would lessen his contact with his students. Ready listener, wise counselor, older friend, surrogate parent, father confessor, as well as born educator, probably all describe JIT's interaction with his charges, who included the returning veterans from World War I, the financially strapped students of the Depression era, and still later, the returning veterans from World War II and Korea. JIT was the go-to person when a student needed some extra assistance, strong encouragement, confidential advice, perhaps a loan, and even a gentle or not so gentle nudge. When JIT retired, a feature article in the Courier, the student magazine of the day, probably had him pegged properly, with the headline, "His door was always open." JIT was ever giving of himself and ever approachable. On a personal note, I entered Georgetown at the very end of JIT's tenure and really didn't get to know him until he retired. I shall be eternally grateful for the great counsel and advice he gave me during the early stages of my career. JIT meant so much to an entire generation of students that there was a groundswell among the alumni to recognize his legacy with a special award. And that was in 1976. What better way indeed to perpetuate his memory than to create a special award for excellence in the conduct of diplomacy. By establishing the endowment, the trustees of the alumni hope that we have followed on to the great tradition and school of the school and this great university. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Again, thank you for your service, and thank you for reminding all of us of what a very important, special, inspiring legacy this award represents. The very best that the school has to offer and has offered so many students for so long. I'd like to introduce now our dean, Joel Hellman. Joel is a scholar and a practitioner, exactly the right combination that we need for this school. He has brought a dynamic enthusiasm over the last 4 years as we are on the cusp of our centennial celebrations, just about to start. He began life as an academic, teaching at both Harvard and Columbia, and then moved over to the World Bank, where he spent 15 years before he came here. His area of expertise is development economics, particularly fragile and failing states, and teaches a course on that. So it doesn't matter where you are in the school, you do teach. Fortunately, he is a native of Brooklyn and attended Williams College as well as Columbia and Oxford. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dean Hellman.
Thank you, Barbara. And can I actually take a moment to recognize Barbara Bodine, who does such a brilliant job running the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Thank you very much, Barbara. We are extraordinarily lucky to have the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy here on the Georgetown campus at this critical moment in the history of diplomacy, and for organizing extraordinary events, for bringing the students together, and for essentially continuing the inspiration for generations of students to continue in the legacy that this school has established over the last 100 years. I really do thank everyone, the board of directors that are here, Barbara and the team and the staff of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy for all they do. But let me first, of course, welcome everyone here, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, the many friends and colleagues of Ambassador Tom Shannon that are with us tonight. Let me give a special welcome to the many students with us this evening from the ISD Certificate in Diplomatic Studies, one of our strongest and largest certificate cohorts on this campus, and the Center on Latin American Studies program, and their director, Father Matt Carnes, who are here. It's great to have you all, and of course, let me welcome Tom Shannon. This is my fourth Trainor Award lecture and dinner, one of my favorite nights of the year. This is an award, as Frank Hogan, our host this evening, has explained, is not named for a distinguished dean, they're a dime a dozen, or a generous donor, but in the true spirit of this school, an administrator, someone who was instrumental in the school's mission of preparing generations of students for successful and effective and ethical careers in global public service. And I'm so pleased to be part of recognizing Jit Trainor and the legacy that he created. During my tenure as dean here, with this award, we've recognized the work of former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz in the increasingly active and important role of the science of diplomacy, the role of science in diplomacy, and in our meeting the complex transnational challenges and problems we collectively face in the global community. We have honored UN Commissioner for Human Rights Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein for his courageous work as a champion for people everywhere to live in dignity and security. And with him, of course, the so many agencies and groups that shared his commitment and share his commitment to the humanity and all its marvelous diversity. And of course, last year, we recognized the lifelong commitment of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, our own Madeleine Albright, to peace, democracy, and a stable international order as both a public servant, as a beloved educator here, and as an advocate. Now, tonight, we are so privileged and pleased to recognize and honor another career public servant for his distinguished commitment to excellence in the conduct of diplomacy. Ambassador Thomas A. Shannon, Jr., Tom, served 35 years in the U.S. Foreign Service under presidential administrations of both parties for a multitude of secretaries of state, retiring only recently as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the third ranking position in the Department of State, and with the personal rank of Career Ambassador, the highest personal rank in the service. Most of Tom's career was spent in Western Hemisphere affairs, as you know, the Americas, our neighbors, both in numerous positions in Washington and across the region, including Ambassador to Brazil. This evening, he will share with you his insights on this rich and dynamic and critical region, whose history and future is so intrinsically bound with our own, and which tends to be one of the least understood, and at times the most maligned, sometimes even demonized. Tom knows better, and better than many, the realities, the facts, and the importance of the Americas to America. I look forward to listening and learning as we all do. There's no question that Tom Shannon has distinguished himself through his expertise and long experience working on U.S. policy toward and in the Americas, as well as a host of truly wicked problems as counselor, Undersecretary to Undersecretary Kerry, and as P, Undersecretary Tillerson. I know that Ambassador Lino Gutierrez, who's both a longtime colleague and a longtime friend of Tom's, will do justice to our guest of honor's many achievements and his many qualities as an officer and a person. I don't want to step on any of Lino's lines. But we honor Tom this evening, not only for his own personal professional achievements, although they're reason enough to honor him, but also for the leadership he provided the department and the career civil and foreign service professionals and personnel who make up the department. True leadership is more than well-grounded in strategic policy making, as important as that is, and as critically needed as that is. Leadership is the ability to inspire and to motivate others, to reaffirm the rightness of a sense of mission and of calling. Leadership is to work tirelessly to ensure that the people you lead know that you have their back, that the commitment and loyalty they demonstrate each and every day is recognized and repaid. No one goes into global public service, or the foreign service for that matter, for the money, as many of you know, the personal glory. No, the operative word here is service. As a Jesuit university, our foundational ethos, of course, is service to others. Now, it is no secret that the Department of State has been going through a rough patch of late, that the value and the very nature of diplomacy has been questioned, and with that questioning, those who conduct our nation's diplomacy have also faced challenges. Tom's extraordinary leadership, his commitment to excellence in the conduct of diplomacy, was a commitment to those, his colleagues and his friends, junior officers at FSI and senior officers throughout the building and in many of our embassies. Now, selfishly, Georgetown and our students can thank Tom and many of the departments because many of their very best people have ended up on the Georgetown campus. Indeed, some people talk about ISD as a refugee camp for the nation's best diplomats. We know that Tom's had a quiet hand in sending some of the best and brightest our way. And we have welcomed each and every one of them into our community. And the department has earned more than a few new recruits, inspired by the remarkable diplomats they have been able to work with here on our campus. Now, I am confident there is more than one aspiring diplomat among our students with us tonight. And so, on their behalf, on behalf of the career diplomats, on behalf of the women and men who share your commitment and dedication to excellence in the conduct of diplomacy, and on behalf of the many whose lives you have had a profound and positive impact, I want to thank you, Ambassador Shannon, for your service, your courage, and your integrity, and I look forward to your remarks tonight. Thank you very much.
What I'd like to do now is introduce Ambassador Lena Gutierrez, who is going to moderate the conversation. Tom will give remarks, and then Lena will moderate the conversation and also manage the questions and answers. Ambassador Gutierrez. Okay. Don't want to be overly familiar. Was a career senior foreign service officer, also specializing in Western Hemisphere affairs. And he has, for the last almost 10 years now, served as the executive director of the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, which is a privately run family foundation, which is dedicated to improving the professional foreign service and the lives of our foreign service and civil service colleagues. He was senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce on Cuban affairs, on the Cuban transition, and on Latin American affairs more broadly. He served, for some reason, we seem to like to count the number of presidents and secretaries of state we work for, 6 and 13 for Leno. He was ambassador to Argentina, where he negotiated counterterrorism and counter-narcotics cooperation, as well as container security, acting assistant secretary for inside baseball, Western Hemisphere affairs, and accompanied Secretary Colin Powell to Lima, Peru, for the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, returning to the United States on September 11th, 2001. He was also ambassador to Nicaragua, where he coordinated relief efforts after Hurricane Mitch. He serves on a number of boards, including the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy's board, and thank you for that service. So I will now turn the program over to Leno.
Dean Hellman, all I can say is great minds think alike. So I apologize if I repeat some of your well-expressed thoughts about Tom Shannon. I would just say that in the tradition of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, Lloyd Henderson, Chip Bolin, Ross Ridgway, William Burns, Ron Newman, and our own Jim Gadsden and Barbara Bodine, follows Tom Shannon, arguably the most talented diplomat of his generation, and perhaps, well, certainly in the final 9, if it's a baseball team, or the Foreign Service playing first base, maybe. But Tom Shannon, all you have to do is look at his CV. Entered the Foreign Service in 1984. Included stops in Guatemala, where he met his wife, Gisela. In the Africa Bureau, special assistant to the ambassador to Brazil in Brasilia, South Africa as regional labor attaché, political counselor in Caracas, Venezuela, NSC director in the Clinton administration, deputy secretary to the OAS under Luis Lauredo in the Clinton administration, and then director of Andean Affairs, deputy assistant secretary, NSC senior director in the Bush administration. Tom, how'd you do that? Exactly. He has shown a remarkable talent to not only become a great advisor to presidents, secretaries of state, but to survive the Washington bureaucratic wars. He once showed me all the stab wounds he had in his back, but he is a survivor. From there, he was ambassador to Brazil. He was a counselor to the State Department, only the second career person to hold this position, one of the few career people to be undersecretary for political affairs. He was acting Secretary of State for the second longest period in history for a career officer, after Larry Eagleburger, the only permanent Secretary of State who came from the career ranks. And he was acting Deputy Secretary. He has filled every job. But tossing the CV aside and beyond the bio and the CV, to echo what Dean Hellman said, during the most difficult time for Foreign Service officers, perhaps, in history, at a time when budgets for the State Department were being slashed by 1/3, when diplomats were being accused of disloyalty, when an unprecedented number of high-level State Department jobs went unfilled, just thereby showing disdain for the career, when ill-advised steps were taken in our foreign policy. For a time, there seemed to be only one person standing between the Foreign Service and Armageddon. One person fighting for the career service. One person persuading young diplomats not to leave the Foreign Service. An indefatigable fighter for the Foreign Service and the career. A voice of reason. And that was Tom Shannon. And for that, we should all be grateful to him. And who knows how things would have been had he not been there. So without further ado, Ambassador Undersecretary Thomas A. Shannon.
Oh, goodness. Okay. This was not in the script I was handed, but I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. Extraordinarily grateful. Thank you, Lena. Thank you very much. You know, it was said of Henry Kissinger that he didn't require an introduction, but always insisted on one. I did not insist on this, but I am very, very grateful for all the kind words that have been said. But Lena, you're a dear friend, a mentor and a colleague, and I've always been grateful for the support you showed me across my many years as a career Foreign Service officer, and I'm very honored to be introduced by you. My father taught me early that we always warm ourselves by fires that other people make. We all feed ourselves at meals by food that other people make. We clothe ourselves with clothes that other people make. And so there's very few of us that can claim to be a self-made person, and I certainly can't be. I've been made by the people that I have worked with over time in the State Department, both Foreign Service officers, civil servants, and political appointees, many of whom are here in the room today, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to all of you. And I'm very honored by the willingness of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and the Trainor trustees to grant me this prestigious award and give me the opportunity to speak with all of you this evening. To Ambassador Bodine, to Mr. Frank Hogan, to Dean Hellman, and the members of the Institute's Board of Advisors, I also extend my profound appreciation for this honor. To look around me and see such extraordinary diplomats and public servants, both colleagues, mentors, and icons, is humbling. And I stand before you unconvinced of my worthiness for this award and uncertain that I can say anything worthy of the experience and accomplishments of those seated here this evening. but let me try. For those of you here tonight who are students and still in the process of discerning your path in life, let me argue on behalf of diplomacy. I had the privilege of being a United States Foreign Service officer for nearly 35 years. My career was a joyful one. I look back upon my time as an American diplomat with gratitude for the opportunity to have served my country during such a consequential period in our history, with humility at the recognition that the forces of destiny only rarely bend themselves to individual will, and with deep respect for the women and men who serve the United States as diplomats and national security professionals. When I look back at my career, I am slack-jawed at the changes I have experienced. When I entered the Foreign Service in 1984, the Soviet Union was alive and well, the Cold War was in full swing, and my first assignment, Guatemala, was part of our effort to contain and defeat communism in our hemisphere. In short order, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet allied governments in Eastern Europe followed suit, communism as a political and economic ordering mechanism was discredited. Regional conflicts, long repressed, reemerged, first in Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and the First Persian Gulf War, then in the Balkans and elsewhere. Global terrorism emerged as a significant threat to the United States with the attack on the USS Cole and the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And of course, September 11 and the military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is not even to mention the rise of ISIS and the destruction of Syria, the reemergence of two giant societies and economies, China and India, into global politics, and the consequences of both WikiLeaks and the Snowden revelations. I look back and realize that I experienced a world transformed. The breadth and extent of the transformation was not always apparent to me. I experienced much of it working at the ragged edge of American power in Africa and Latin America. I was what we called a dusty roads diplomat, always working in countries in transition. I saw the impact of American power and understood how that power could influence these transitions for our benefit and that of our partners. But the changes I experience will pale in comparison to what the next generation of American diplomats will face. It would be easy to list the immediate and urgent foreign policy challenges that the United States faces at this moment, from Syria to Venezuela to Iran, Russia, China, and the DPRK, to name just a few, and then to pronounce on the efficacy and effectiveness of the steps the United States is taking in regard to each. It would also be easy to propound on the supposed revival of great power politics and whether or not the liberal world order, the favorite unicorn of our foreign policy establishment, has passed away. But my purpose is different tonight. I would like to move beyond a description of the challenges we face and instead identify the larger forces or trends at work in the world and explain why our own hemisphere, the Americas, is a strategic reserve for the United States that needs to be treated with great care and attention if we are to be successful in protecting and advancing our national security interests. In the process, I hope to make a larger point. We are at a moment of eclipse and rebirth in American foreign policy, just as consequential as that which happened after World War II. Unlike that time, however, the changes we are living through today are not the product of cataclysm, but instead of the remarkable way we have reshaped the world and its political and economic order. To use former Secretary of State Dean Acheson's words, we are once again present at the creation. The drivers of the profound changes we are experiencing and the effervescence and tumult they produce have been the object of much study. I think the best of these studies has been done by the National Intelligence Council, or the NIC. The NIC, through its Strategic Futures Group, has produced two seminal studies for two administrations, the Global Trends series. The first, the Global Trends Alternative Worlds, was written for the Obama administration. The second, Global Trends, Paradox of Progress, was written for the Trump administration. The first study, Alternative Worlds, identified 4 major drivers of change in our world today. The first is the rise of the individual and the global middle class, which is the product of the extraordinary economic change that globalization has produced and the remarkable transfer of wealth from west to east. The middle class, which historically, as a social and economic phenomenon, was restricted to North America and Northern Europe, now expands the globe. There are more middle-class people in China today than there are Americans. The second driver is the transformation of power and the flattening of the world. This is the product of American domination and the end of ideological struggles, leaving the United States as the only superpower or hyperpower, and the only power with the ability to project itself anywhere at any time, but not everywhere all the time. And therefore, the United States has to exercise judiciousness and determine who its partners and allies will be, and when we need to involve ourselves in disputes. But the flattening of the world also allows regional powers to arise, several with global ambitions, who constantly test the United States and what we value as they pursue their own regional interests along borders or beyond those borders. This is what Ukraine and Crimea is about. This is what the South China Sea is about. This is what Turkey's interests in northern Syria are about. I could go on. This is what Kashmir is about. The third great driver of change is demographics and the aging of the world. And believe it or not, I'm now 61. I am now a member of the fastest growing age cohort in the world. You would think that the fastest growing age cohort would be at the start of life and not at the back end. But because of the rise of the individual and the global middle class, those of us, and I'll get to this point later, but those of us who have access to resources live longer. And this has caused an aging of the world. But it has also left what demographers call structural youth or chronic youthfulness in parts of the world that in a perfect world would be a competitive advantage, because if you had the job skill training necessary and the economic opportunities necessary, this would create a huge economic boon. But the structural youthfulness of this part of the world is typically bounded by conflict and poverty and exclusion, and creates a ready source of young men and women to be radicalized, to be brought into jihadist organizations, trans-criminal organizations, to be used as cannon fodder and make conflicts more difficult to resolve, and to drive migration as young people seek a better life elsewhere. And the final driver of change is the nexus of food, energy, and water, which again is related to what comes before. It's all about the need to find more energy and more food, which requires more water. And it also means that as we look at areas of conflict and cooperation in the future, they will tend to collect around hydrological basins. We should be very happy that we have the Great Lakes and the Mississippi and the Missouri and the Columbia all within our boundaries. The second study, Paradox of Progress, takes these 4 drivers of change and identifies major trends produced by them. The first is that the rich are aging and the poor are not. The second is that the global economy is shifting, with wealth moving from west to east. The third is that technology is accelerating but creating discontinuities and inequality of access. The fourth is that ideas and identities are creating a new wave of exclusion in the world, which is a reaction to globalization and an effort by people to protect themselves and those they deem to be of their tribe or clan. The fifth is that governing is getting harder. And this is really related to the rise of the individual and the flattening of the world, or the transformation of power, because increasingly there are more veto points, not only in decision-making, but also in decision implementation. And sometimes those veto points are political, sometimes they're violent and terroristic. 6, the nature of conflict is changing. For those of you who have been tracking this closely, I'm sure you understand that today, a cyber attack is probably more threatening and dangerous than a nuclear attack. And 7, deferred challenges are converging and now require attention, especially in regards to climate change, global health care, transformative technologies, and migration, among others. But we find ourselves in a moment in which, although these challenges are converging, our ability to deal with them is not. The drivers of change and the trends articulated in these studies are transforming in the world in front of us. They are fundamentally challenging or changing how people live, how people create and innovate, how people prosper or not, how people think, how people govern, how people fight. The National Intelligence Council asserts that the dramatic shifts in the global landscape portend a dark and difficult future, largely defined by rising tensions and conflict within and between countries. It posits that the outcome of the period through which we are now passing will be determined by how we answer 3 sets of questions. First, how do we create political order in an age of empowered individuals and rapidly changing economies? How do individuals, groups, and governments renegotiate their expectations to achieve that order? Second, can states create new patterns of international cooperation and competition? And what new kinds of global architecture will be built? The third, will and can governments prepare now for the multifaceted problems that will soon overwhelm us, from climate change to migration to transformative technologies? Underlying the uncertainty of the world presented by the National Intelligence Council is a lack of overall shared strategic understandings. This has led increasingly to problem-centered ad hoc and issue-specific cooperation. It has made it harder to work in multidisciplinary or universal ways. The resulting loss of coherence among international institutions is palpable. And as if this were not enough, the harder problems lie ahead, and in a time when there are brakes on collective agenda setting and cooperation. This is not the first time the world has been transformed, but this transformation will be the fastest, the most far-reaching, and the one that affects the most people. It will also be a transformation that challenges our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be an individual, how our societies cohere, and the nature of the social contract that exists between government and the governed. It is at this moment that I take comfort from Steely Dan. In the album Pretzel Logic, there is a song called Any Major Dude. And one stanza sings, "Any major dude will surely tell you, my friend, any amount of world that breaks apart falls together again." The world falls together again in the Western Hemisphere. It falls together again right here. You are all familiar with the extraordinary democratization of our hemisphere that occurred during the 1980s and 1990s. It was the product of internal dissent and heroic political action in the countries of Central and South America, and the far-sighted diplomacy of the United States. In short order, the countries of the Americas transformed themselves from authoritarian to democratic governments, from closed to open economies, from economies based on import substitution models of development to economies based on regional integration and trade, from exclusive to inclusive societies, and from isolation to global engagement. In the process, the region built new mechanisms for political engagement and trade, including Mercosur, the Andean Community, the Central American Integration System, or CICA, the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, the famous ALBA, Venezuelan creation, CELAC, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the free trade agreements with Chile, Panama, Peru, and Colombia, the Arc of the Pacific, and the Pacific Alliance. This innovation was matched in North America by the creation of NAFTA, now the US, Mexico, Canada Trade Agreement, the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, and the North American Leaders Summit. And of course, the Summit of the Americas process and that old perennial, the OAS. In retrospect, what happened in the Americas was a remarkable accomplishment. We, the United States and our partners in the region, built a hemisphere defined by common political values and democratic constitutional processes, defined by common economic understandings and a commitment to markets, trade, and regional integration. We addressed outstanding conflict in the region through the Colombia peace process and the Central American peace process, ended the border conflict between Peru and Ecuador, and helped foster the world's first successful nuclear non-proliferation agreement when Brazil and Argentina agreed to end their nuclear weapons programs. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we won broad hemispheric support to our larger counterterrorism agenda, revitalized our collective security arrangements, and modernized the hemispheric security focus, incorporating non-traditional threats posed by non-state actors, and introduced economic and social factors into our regional security thinking. In the process, we created new mechanisms of security cooperation, such as the Merida Initiative with Mexico, the Central American Regional Security Initiative, and the newly inclusive Northern Command and Southern Command. So think about this again. On the cusp of dramatic global political change and facing new and dangerous national security threats, we constructed a hemisphere that was at peace, posed no immediate threat to the United States, broadly shared political values and a common framework of action, tied together by trading agreements, and positioned in a global economy to take advantage of energy self-sufficiency, the largest reserves of fresh water and arable land in the world, the largest food-producing and exporting nations in the world, a free trade platform along its Pacific Rim facing the world's largest markets, and a combined population less than that of China, about half of China. And the impressive strategic accomplishment weathered a well-financed and thought-out reaction led by Venezuela and the remains of traditional leftist and radical political parties in South and Central America. That resistance has largely exhausted itself and survives only in the ruins of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and parts of Bolivia's high Andes. But the story does not end here. Our hemisphere is embarked on the next great phase of political, economic, and social development. It is attempting to use democratic institutions and constitutional processes and procedures, in other words, democratic government, to create democratic societies. Democracy, which was seen initially as giving people a voice in determining national destiny, is now being seen as an essential part of giving peoples a voice in determining their individual destiny. In other words, ensuring that individuals have the resources, opportunities, and security necessary to realize their full potential as human beings. This is a remarkable ambition, and it has significant implications. First, it means that democracy is not a status quo political system. Instead, it is a system capable of profound social change, addressing problems of poverty, inequality, and social exclusion within a relatively peaceful and stable political environment. Second, it changes the nature of legitimacy. Legitimacy is no longer linked only to process, such as elections. It is also linked to outcomes. Increasingly, the value of democracy will be measured by the development it delivers and the open society it supports. Third, all of this creates a huge opportunity for the United States. Building off what we have already accomplished, we can, with the right kind of engagement and investment, build resilient, open societies and markets in the Americas with a tradition and practice of dialogue and peaceful resolution of disputes, and institutions to promote and channel common purpose and collaboration. As I mentioned, the Americas can become our strategic reserve and our partner in recreating the world while we face dramatic security challenges elsewhere in the world. Which brings me back to Dean Acheson's words and his memoir, Present at the Creation. Acheson starts his memoirs with an epigraph from King Alfonso X, who you all know was the king of Castile, Leon, and Galicia in the 13th century. King Alfonso X said, "Had I been present at the creation, I would have given some useful hints for the better ordering of the world." The theme of beginning, of creating, plays largely in Atchison's work and the uncertainty that it implies. Speaking of the post-war environment, Atchison said that the United States faced a task, the enormity of which only slowly revealed itself. He wrote, "The state of the world in those years and almost all that happened during them was wholly novel within the experience of those who had to deal with them." He described the period of 1941 to 1952 as one of great obscurity to those who lived through it. He liked to quote British historian C.V. Wedgwood, who wrote, "History is lived forward, but it is written in retrospect. We know the end before we consider the beginning, and we can never wholly recapture what it is to know the beginning only." As I noted, I believe we are once again at a moment of beginning, but I also believe that it is possible to capture and know it looking forward, not backward. Atchison described the efforts of his colleagues as defined by determination, boundless energy, and near complete ignorance of the challenges faced. Maybe that's why they took up the challenge. Nevertheless, he called the work done as an imaginative effort unique in history and even greater than that made in the preceding period of fighting. Think about that for a minute. The reshaping and rebuilding the world was a harder job than defeating the Nazis and the Japanese. He said during this time, he and his colleagues were guided by a corpus diplomaticum that was a repository of precedent and common sense that acted as an aid to judgment. He wrote, "Its central aim and purpose was to safeguard the highest interest of our nation, which was to maintain as spacious an environment as possible in which free states might exist and flourish. Underlying it all was a recognition that the challenge was to help the free world emerge from chaos without blowing the whole world apart in the process." He described the response to this challenge as one of expanding action. As we consider the challenges in front of us today, I think we can claim, as Atchison did, that we have the same energy and boundless determination. But we cannot claim ignorance of the immensity of the challenge. I think we know what we face, and I think we know what we have to do. I would argue that our first task lies in the Americas, that securing this hemispheric reserve of democracy, promoting its peacefulness and prosperity, and guaranteeing its institutions against the corrosiveness of self-interest and misplaced nationalism should be our priority. In the process, our purpose should be to create a larger view of the future and to instill hope and offer solidarity. As Atchison wrote, this will require an imaginative effort of great depth and vision. But we know that we are capable of this because we have done it before. I'm extraordinarily grateful to be here tonight and to receive the JIT Trainor Award because of what it signifies and who JIT Trainor was. As Frank Hogan noted, he was a dedicated part of a great university and a great school that prepared women and men to face the world, ready and confident to leave a positive impact. But the challenge in front of many of you here will be even greater. You will live in the world you create. You will not be along for the ride. All of you, if you so choose, can live lives of great significance and consequence. Lives that will be remembered and remarked upon by generations to come. And to those of you who are preparing to go out into the world, I salute you. Thank you very much for your patience this evening, for listening to me, and for giving me this great honor. Thank you. Goodness gracious. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. Okay. Now comes the hard part. That's fine.
Thank you. Well, Tom, as a Latin Americanist, I am heartened to hear you about how you see the future of the hemisphere and the job we have to do. And I want to commend you for being the only speaker in history who have mentioned Steely Dan and Alfonso X in the same speech. But a Renaissance man like you can do that. And before we ask a question that's on everybody's mind, which is, what's Steve Bannon really like? I thought we would talk about some of the fires burning in the hemisphere. And of course, the biggest fire is Venezuela, a country where you have experience as political counselor in the days of Chavez. You have been a special emissary to the current president, Mr. Maduro. And how do you see this conflict, the situation where we have two presidents, where we have half the world supporting one side and the other half the other? Are we on the right path? What should be done? How do you see a situation?
Well, thank you for the softball question. This could take up the rest of the evening. I'll try to make sure it doesn't. Venezuela is a country I care deeply about for the reasons you noted. I served there for a period of time and have been involved in things Venezuelan for quite some time. Remarkable country, remarkable people. And watching the slow, steady collapse of that country's economy and seeing the impact on its society and the humanitarian crisis it finds itself in right now is a very painful thing. In some ways, I tried at different moments, along with a variety of international institutions and international diplomats, to seek some kind of electoral exit from the political conflict inside the country without success, which still bothers me to this day, but it has also taught me that mediators are only good as the parties involved in the mediation. And as one Venezuelan told me at one point, this situation will never be solved until Venezuelans decide whether they want to reconcile or fight. And as long as they're betwixt and between, it's going to be very difficult to resolve this. For what it's worth, what the opposition did and Juan Guaido did in declaring the presidency vacant and declaring Guaido as the president of the National Assembly to be the interim president was in many ways politically a masterstroke, because it returned recognizing that an electoral solution was not possible. It opened up the possibility of a constitutional transition independent of an election. And that's the reason why the United States and the Lima Group, which is most of the countries of South America and Central America and Canada, very quickly recognized Guaido and then sought the recognition of the European community. That was all the right thing to do, because it was forcing an institutional solution to a problem. And this is what brought Venezuelans back out onto the streets. They would not have gone out onto the streets for just another protest, just another moment to express their concern and disdain for what was happening in their own society. But they would come out if they thought that this was a real opportunity to resolve things. Regrettably, I think many people here and elsewhere thought that this was going to be a very quick operation and that the armed forces would flip within the first 24 or 48 hours. That has not happened. And it's not happened for the reasons that you can imagine. The armed forces is a deeply flawed institution at this time, thoroughly corrupted by both the Chavez government and the Maduro government, and one which is trying to hold its institutional integrity together in order to prevent a splintering that would probably create armed conflict inside of Venezuela. The decision to effectively stop purchasing oil from Venezuela through PDVSA and now separate PDVSA from its U.S. subsidiary Citgo is a very aggressive move by the United States, but it's designed to give greater authority and legitimacy to the opposition. But the opposition really does not have access to those funds to use inside of Venezuela. And then, of course, there's the Cuban factor, with the Cubans knowing, thanks to speeches given by the National Security Advisor and the President, that if Venezuela falls, Cuba's next. And so the Cubans are quite determined to fight forward on this one and do everything they can to keep Maduro afloat until they can find a reasonable way out of this. And there's a big event set for this Saturday when Vice President Pence will be in Colombia, and there will be an effort to push humanitarian assistance from Cucuta, Colombia, into Venezuela. I very much doubt that the Venezuelan military will allow that to happen. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's some way to create a quick and easy solution to this problem. But I'm actually concerned that we're heading into a larger period of siege or stalemate in which Maduro and his government and most of the security forces will rally inside the castle, and the Venezuelan population will rally outside the castle. And then it's just a question of who lasts longest. I mean, over time, the ability of this government to last long does not seem good, given the suffocation that the global economy is going to attempt to impose on them. But the government doesn't need a lot. It just needs somebody to buy the 500,000 barrels a day of petroleum that they would normally sell to us. The Indians have already indicated a willingness to buy a big hunk of it. If the Chinese and Russians pick up the rest, the government will have the resources to carry on. So I'm actually very worried at this point because we have created a process and a structure that is designed to drive Maduro from power. And if he doesn't go, we're going to be faced with a situation in which we're going to have to do something more dramatic to resolve the problem. So I just thought I'd cheer you up.
Thank you. I want to leave enough time for a couple of questions, but Brazil was another country. Of course, you were ambassador there. You had 2 tours. How do you see the election of Mr. Bolsonaro? And he's been described as a Donald Trump of South America. How do you see that relationship progressing and Mr. Bolsonaro's government?
Well, I mean, Bolsonaro's election was almost guaranteed with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. Not that he had declared himself at that point, but it was pretty evident to anybody who had spent time in Brazil that the impeachment of Rousseff, the arrest and imprisonment of Lula, and then the arrest and imprisonment of many members of the political class and the economic elite because of corruption scandals, broke a fundamental bond between political parties and the Brazilian public, and that the Brazilians were not going to choose anybody coming out of the traditional political parties, that they were going to look elsewhere. And in that regard, Jair Bolsonaro is a tropical Trump. He is somebody who found an ability to exploit the profound dissatisfaction that Brazilians have in their political class, great concern over their own security and the direction of their economy, and prepared to reach out and try something different and radical and maybe even frightening in order to build some kind of new energy within their country. The success of Bolsonaro is going to depend entirely on his self-discipline. If he focuses on addressing security issues, getting the economy up and running, and improving the relationship with the United States, he will remain very popular. If he begins to expand and address his larger social agenda, if he begins to not care for the Amazon and biodiversity in the way that most Brazilians want it cared for, if he views indigenous peoples as just an impediment to agricultural development, if he carries out a kind of a hostile social environment or social policies, especially in regard to the LGBTQ community, I think he's going to find himself locked up in disputes inside of Brazil that will weaken him. And not so much disputes with political parties and political leaders, but with civil society, which is very strong in Brazil. So I think to the extent that he can stay on those courses that got him elected, he has the potential of transforming Brazilian politics as traditional Brazilian politicians attempt to rebuild whatever trust or confidence they can with the Brazilian people.
Well, there are many other topics we could discuss here. Central American migration, the fact that you yourself dissented when President Trump declared an end to TPS for some countries. Those days in the State Department when the Trump administration took over, and all the budget cuts that are being proposed, and your advice to then Secretary Tillerson. These are all fascinating topics. But I do want to leave time for a couple of questions. And then we have to present you with the award, and we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock, right, Barbara?
We're not going to make 9 o'clock.
Okay, well, so I want to open it up for questions.
Yeah, we've got time for questions.
Okay. So please, do we have microphones or not? Okay. Identify yourself, please, and who you are, whom you represent, if anybody, and ask a question. Don't be shy. Gentleman back here.
Craig Kelly. Tom, you talked about strategic reserve. You know, if you look at some of the institutions you cited in the Western Hemisphere, we had these groupings, Mercosur, the Pacific Rim and Free Trade, ALBA, CARICOM. They've all been, you know, profoundly transformed because of changes. How do those changes, you know, the two, you know, the Atlantic and Pacific sides of the continent reaching out more to each other, ALBA disappearing and so forth, how does that affect our ability to work with this strategic reserve?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. That's a great question because in many ways, those organizations like ALBA and CELAC, which were created to exclude the United States and to have a place where Latins and the Caribbean could have a conversation absent us and didn't always have to address the issue of Cuba, were useful for a period of time. But they have broken down with the emergence of center-right governments and governments that want to have a conversation with us and don't particularly look well on Cuba or what's been happening in Venezuela. And in some ways, while the regional institutions like the North American institutions, the Central American institutions, the Caribbean community, and to a certain extent, the primary building blocks in South America are still strong. I think most importantly, this creates a huge new opportunity for the OAS, which has weathered this period of time reasonably well and has endured the political differences in the region, but can now begin to assert itself more as a truly institution that covers the entire hemisphere. And so that's good. In regard to the difference between the Atlantic South America and the Pacific South America, the only good thing to come out of the President's decision to step away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership is that it's actually created some additional time to allow the Pacific Rim of South America, the free trading rim, to build inroads into Mercosur. And this has become easier now, first of all, because Venezuela is no longer a member of Mercosur, but also because the governments, the center-right governments in Argentina and Brazil are quite keen on being part of a partnership that allows them to continue to trade into Asia without having to worry about their Pacific Rim neighbors kind of getting in front of them in that trading relationship. So my hope is that with some strong regional diplomacy that they will find a way to ensure that South America is not sundered down the middle, and that when we finally decide to re-engage in TPP, that we will be able to re-engage as an entire hemisphere.
I'd like to take a question from students. This is your chance. I can't see. Gentleman there.
Logan Smith in the Masters of Foreign Service program. I appreciated you referencing the NIC reports. I spent last semester studying them for one of our courses. And I'm curious if you could maybe comment on ways that you think our diplomacy needs to change, because these trends have also affected the way we conduct diplomacy. How does it need to change or evolve in order to meet the needs or the demands which you set forth, to leverage specifically the strengths of opportunities we have in the Americas?
No, that's a great question. Thank you. To begin with, I'm not much of a futurologist, but what struck me about the NIC reports and and others, especially the ones done out of Davos, is that they're really future scenarios, and they offer kind of a series of possible worlds that we're looking at based on the changes and the drivers of changes and the trends that they produce. And I'm increasingly convinced that our foreign policy has to be have a future scenario component to it. It's almost like a design session in the sense that you're looking at the kind of world you want to achieve, and you're trying to understand what factors will help you get there. And so thinking out 10 years, 15 years can actually be very helpful, and it can also help us identify problems we shouldn't be too worried about and highlight things that we really have ignored but really shouldn't. And in some ways, you know, the State Department in particular is a unique institution. It's really built on a 19th century British Foreign Office model of hub and spoke. And there's lots of complaints about that because the concern is that we don't do the regional work that well, or the sub-regional work. My own experience, however, is that the State Department is really the most forward deployed agency in the United States government. There's really hardly any place in the world that it doesn't sit. And that allows the State Department to kind of be like a miner at the rock face. You're working that rock every day, and you know exactly where the gold vein is. You know when the rock starts to tremble. You know when the cavern's going to collapse. Oftentimes in ways that other agencies don't. And if you have the right kind of transmission belts coming from the embassies back into the department and into the geographic bureaus, and if you have the right team as an assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretaries, you have an ability to turn around this information very quickly and get it to the secretary and the deputy secretary and others who are involved in larger interagency processes. And so I'm not so big on kind of massive transformations or transitions. I typically view those efforts you know, in the same vein as the Hippocratic Oath, which is first and foremost, do no harm. And that we really need to be focusing on the capacity and capabilities of our people in the field, how easily they can communicate back into the department, and how quickly the bureaus can transform what's being fed back in ways that are meaningful for our policymakers. And of course, because of the nature of the changes that are taking place, we need different kinds of expertise, and we're going to have to sit down and think long and hard about what that's going to be. But I have great faith in our diplomats. I have great faith in the women and men who are out there every day working this. And I think the problem does not lie so much in our structures, but it lies in our political leadership.
Okay, I think we can take one last question. Going once. Jeff. Just come up for, okay.
I know you think I'm going to ask about Cuba, but I won't. What I wanted to ask about was the fact that we are at Georgetown University, a Catholic university, a Jesuit university, and it struck me that a lot of the diplomatic issues that you've dealt with have involved the Vatican and Vatican diplomacy. And I wonder if you could offer some comment on how they go about conducting their foreign policy, how they are as mediators. Is there something we can learn from them, or vice versa?
Thank you. First of all, Jeff's a dear friend and a much admired colleague, and there's many of you in the audience today, and I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to work alongside all of you for so long. As I mentioned earlier, you really have shaped me as an officer and as a person, and I could not have done any of this without having worked alongside all of you. And Jeff is remarkable in many ways. I would have wished he'd asked me a question about Cuba. But you know, I found, first of all, you cannot help but be impressed when you go to the Vatican and you go to meet the Secretary of State or any of the cardinals or others who oversee aspects of the Vatican's relations around the world. And, you know, it's probably the world's oldest diplomatic service, oldest continually functioning diplomatic service. It has a history, a presence, a perspective that is remarkable and is always worth listening to. As mediators, for instance, in the first effort to fashion a dialogue process in Venezuela, it was a haphazard process at the beginning. UNASUR attempted, through a former Colombian president, Ernesto Samper, to start a dialogue that the opposition refused to participate in. We then, in negotiations between the government and the opposition, were able to cobble together a group featuring the former president of Spain, of Panama, and the Dominican Republic to begin a dialogue between the government and the opposition. The opposition grew very quickly wary of the mediators and asked that we bring in the Vatican. We decided to bring in we asked the Vatican to send someone in. The Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, who had been the papal nuncio in Caracas, wanted none of it. He knew both the government and the opposition leaders, didn't trust them, thought that the Vatican was going to make a big mistake by committing the prestige of the Pope to the negotiations. But the Pope, to his credit, decided that the Vatican needed to do something. And so they put out a Monsignor who was the lead Vatican negotiator with China, as the Vatican attempted to create a new concordat with the Chinese. And he came into the negotiations, and in 2 sessions he had a deal. Both sides agreed to it at the table. It really was a roadmap out of the current crisis in Venezuela. But regrettably, the negotiators of both sides could not sell the deal to their constituents. The government negotiators could not sell it to the hardliners in the government, and the opposition negotiators couldn't sell it to the hardliners on the opposition side. So the deal broke apart. But the Vatican's role was central. But unfortunately, because of that experience, the Vatican backed out. My other interesting experience was meeting with the cardinal who was in charge of Catholic and Christian communities in the Middle East, as those communities were being ground to dust by the fighting in Iraq and then the ISIS rampage through Syria. And meeting with this cardinal was a remarkable experience because the fury he directed at us, the seething anger that he barely contained at our stupidity and arrogance of unleashing forces in a finely balanced area where the only hope of survival for Chaldeans and Jews and Orthodox Catholics and Zoroastrians and Yazidis and all the minority groups scattered through Iraq and Syria, their only hope was order. Their only hope was peace. Their only hope was stability. And that unlocking the demons of war meant that these communities were going to be overrun. And quite convinced that the damage had been done and that nobody was ever going to convince a Chaldean living in Detroit to return to Syria. And for me, that was a profound lesson, more than anything else, in the perspective of the Vatican and how it understood politics and diplomacy. For them, it was about protecting communities. It was about recognizing their weakness and their vulnerability, and then trying to ensure that that couldn't be exploited by doing everything possible to keep the peace. And I mean, you can argue with that approach, but as we get deeper into this 21st century, as we get deeper into a century that really is going to be defined by conflict, I think that order and stability will become virtues that we appreciate again in ways that we might not appreciate now.
Yeah, let's not forget that the Vatican played an instrumental role in stopping the conflict between Argentina and Chile in the 70s in the Beagle Channel. With that, Ambassador Undersecretary Thomas A. Shannon, thank you for all you did on behalf of democracy, on behalf of the hemisphere, on behalf of the Foreign Service, and for your service to the United States of America.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Lino just very eloquently took all my closing lines, but you did it much better than I would have, and so I appreciate that. There is an award part to this, but before I get to that, I want to thank some very important people here. Obviously, the Dean for his continued support for ISD, the best board of advisors that anybody could hope to have. I want to thank Father Carnes for your leadership within the school and your leadership of the Center for Latin American Studies and your support for tonight's event and your students and faculty who came tonight. I want to particularly recognize the students who are here tonight. We've got a bunch of people up here talking about history that we all lived and our hopes for the future. You are the ones for whom life is a future tense verb. So could the students who have joined us tonight just stand up so we can recognize you? And thank you for coming and being part of this. We've laid out all the problems. You now get to come up with the solutions. You will be graded later. We're all being graded. Tom, I want to thank you so very much for your service, and Lino said it all better than I did, but your service, your integrity, your character, and your expertise, and for, again, agreeing to accept this award from the Institute and the university. I understand that Arnold and Porter, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. Anyway, a group of very wise people had the wisdom to bring you on when you left the department. And I'm sure that they treat you very well and that you're doing, you're still being able to bring your expertise and experience to the table. I don't know exactly how well they have helped you move from a State Department office, which comes with the standard furniture that we all see our entire careers. So we would like to, as part of our award recognition of you, help you decorate your new office. You're sitting in it. Yes. So that we will get that to you. But we wanted something that would... Good, okay. Well, good. Well, I'm sure that you have enough plaques and tchotchkes, so we wanted to give you the biggest tchotchke in your entire office. It is an honor to have you here. It is an honor to have you as a colleague, and it has been an honor to have you share your views with everyone tonight. And so, on behalf of Trainor and the school and the university and these marvelous students, thank you so much.